So the last thing to build out in the not-so-tiny house kitchen was the island, which would serve as both a prep surface as well as the main dining surface in the tiny house. And to further complicate things, I also decided to install an under-counter ice maker in the island, both to provide ice for the tiny house since the small fridge doesn't have an ice maker, but also to support my recent kind of obsession with craft cocktails. And this tiny house and the adjoining patio will definitely be a major hangout spot come summertime. Anyway, because of the water supply line and drain requirements for the ice maker, I ended up needing to frame out a small wall, sometimes called a pony wall, to house the plumbing and electrical, and I started by building the wall. Once the wall was assembled, I could get the holes drilled for the plumbing and electrical, and unfortunately this wall landed right on a joist. And the electrical was located on one side of the joist and the plumbing was on the other side, so I had to kind of split the difference when locating the holes. Next, I got the wall positioned, pulling measurements off of the other walls in the house to make sure it was parallel, and then I screwed it to the joist below with 3-inch screws to lock the wall in place. With the wall secured, I could work on getting the water supply and drain boxes installed. First, I figured out where I wanted to mount the boxes, and then I could drill a hole for the drain line, and of course my camera died right as I started to drill the hole. Once the hole was drilled, I could get the water supply box installed permanently, and I started by cutting the cap off of the PEX line, which the plumbers had installed, and of course I turned off the water to the house first as well. After cutting, I used this little tool to chamfer the edge of the PEX and also mark how far I needed to push the fitting onto the PEX to make sure it was fully seated. This water supply box has a push connect fitting, so it was easy to attach the PEX line, pushing it onto the PEX until it met up with that line I just marked, and then I could screw the box to the stud. And this box has a quarter turn shutoff valve and is meant to supply an ice maker, which is exactly what I needed here. Next, I could get the drain box installed, and as you can see, I had to drill the hole through the floor at a slight angle to avoid the joist below. And because of this, I needed to add a 22.5 degree fitting directly below the drain box to match this angle. After dry fitting everything, I went ahead and glued the parts together with this OD Fusion self-priming PVC cement, and this stuff really simplifies the process of gluing PVC in my opinion, as you only need one can to do the job as it's self-priming. Once that was done, I reattached the box to the stud and then headed under the tiny house to install the P-trap and extend the drain line away towards the outside of the house. And I didn't try to film this process, but here's the finished result. Figuring out where to locate the outlet on this island, which is required by code, was a little tricky as I wouldn't have a spot on either side. And so after doing some research, I finally decided to go with a pop-up outlet located right in the countertop. And that'll be nice because I'm imagining guests will work at this island with laptops and other devices that need to be charged. The pop-up outlet needs a 3.5-inch hole for mounting, and I started to drill a hole in the wall, but figured it might be better to reinforce the wall first by installing the drywall just to kind of tie everything together. Installing the drywall was easy enough, although the thickness of the Motobox mounting brackets caused the drywall to bow out a good bit and even break in one spot, and this all caused some issues later on, which you'll see. I also installed a GFCI outlet here due to its proximity to the water supply. Once the outlet was in, I snapped the cover rings onto the Motoboxes, and then I could get back to drilling the hole for the pop-up outlet. Once that was drilled, I routed the Romex for the outlet up through the hole and stapled it to the stud to secure it. With that done, I could finally get the cabinet installed in the island, and this was the same process as installing the other base cabinets in the kitchen, so go check out my video on that process in case you missed it. And while I'm working, let's take a second to talk about the sponsor of this week's video, Dr. Squatch. Dr. Squatch sent me their Suave bundle with a few of their body soaps, plus their shampoo, conditioner, and deodorant to try, and I've got to say, I really like them. First of all, they smell great, especially that grapefruit IPA scent as a craft beer lover. I also love their ingredient transparency. They use all natural, sustainably sourced ingredients that you can actually pronounce. I also felt super clean after using their soap, and they lathered better than a lot of other natural soaps I've tried. So if you want to grab some Dr. Squatch goodies for your next shower, click my link and use my code DSQCrafted to get 20% off any order over $20. Thanks again to Dr. Squatch for sponsoring this video and helping me feel a little cleaner. And now let's get back to work. Eventually though, the cabinet was installed level and plumb, so I could work on getting the ice maker hooked up. The installation process for the ice maker was pretty simple. First, I connected the water supply line on the ice maker to the water supply I had just installed, and then I fed the drain hose into the drain outlet. I could then slide the ice maker into place in the island, and it's designed to fit in a standard 15-inch cabinet opening, although it is finished on the sides and the top if you want to use it as a standalone unit. I got the filter installed next, and let it do its thing overnight. I came back the next morning to a full ice bin, and it produces these awesome 1.5-inch square cubes, which are crystal clear so they look awesome in a cocktail. With that, the ice maker was ready to go, so I moved it out of the way temporarily while I got the finished panels installed. So I needed to cover both sides and the back of the island, and I wanted to do it without adding any unnecessary trim to keep this kind of clean, modern look going, so this was a bit of a project in and of itself. So I started back in my shop while I was working on building the kitchen cabinets, and the first step was to get the pieces cut to size at the table saw. Next, I edge banded the front and back edges of the side panels since those would be visible in the finished installation, and then I could figure out the joinery for the panels. So thankfully, I just received a new tool that was perfect for this project, the Lamello Zeta P2. And you can think of the Zeta as kind of a biscuit joiner on steroids, as it works in a similar way but has the ability to cut these specialized slots to fit these plastic connector pieces, which are also made by Lamello. I started by doing a test run on some scraps just to see how everything went together, and as you can see, these Clamex connectors come in 2 halves, each of which can be slid into the slots cut by the Zeta. The pieces can then be snapped together to lock the pieces together, and if you add a bead of glue prior to snapping the pieces together, the clamping pressure created by the connectors is enough so you don't need to add any more clamps. With the test pieces looking good, I could move on to the island pieces, and laying out the location of the connectors is similar to biscuits or dominoes. I marked lines across the edges of all the pieces, and then transferred those lines to the outer face of the back panel with a square. I could then cut the slots into the edges of the back panel with the Zeta, and you can see the little groove created in the slot, which allows those connectors to slip in securely and be held in place with no glue. Next, I cut the slots into the inside faces of the side panels, and I needed to orient the Zeta vertically for these cuts. With that done, I painted these panels just like the rest of the cabinets, and then fast forward a few weeks, I was ready to assemble the panels into one unit once everything was in the tiny house, without having to try and move the island panels already assembled. I started the assembly by sliding the connectors into the slots in the panels, and then I laid one of the panels on the floor. I added a bead of CA glue as my adhesive of choice, as wood glue wouldn't have bonded to the painted surfaces that well, and then I snapped the back panel into place. And the nice thing about this system is you have a little wiggle room for adjustment side to side, so I got everything flushed up before moving on to the next panel. And this was the exact same process, and I didn't use activator with the CA glue here to give me a little more time to make any alignment adjustments. With all the panels assembled, I could slide them into place around the pony wall, and thankfully they fit perfectly. Next, I got the whole assembly shimmed up so it was flush with the top of the pony wall, since the flooring will run under these panels, and also made sure everything was level and plumb while I was at it. I also clamped the front edge together temporarily, as I'll be adding a stretcher there a little bit later. I got the left side panel attached to the cabinet to lock it into place using some 1.25 inch screws from inside the cabinet, and then I could turn my attention to the back panel. I wanted to attach the panel to the studs at the top and bottom, and I decided to tuck these screws under where the countertop supports will be installed, as I need to add something to support the countertop overhang in this area. To keep the countersink bit from scuffing up the paint, I added some painter's tape, and then once the holes were pre-drilled, I added the screws. I repeated the same steps to add 3 more screws at the bottom of the back panel. To connect the other side panel to the cabinet, I cut a stretcher off camera and added some pocket holes so I could attach it between the cabinet and the side panel. And this sets the spacing between the cabinet and the side panel, and I'll add an angle bracket at the bottom of this side panel later on. Once all that was done, I could reinstall the drawers and get them adjusted. Now that the island was built, I could finally get the countertops installed here in the kitchen, but before they were installed, I needed to add some support brackets to the backside of the island. And the countertop will overhang this area by about 15 inches, creating the main dining surface in the tiny house, and since I was going with quartz countertops, I needed to add some support brackets here. I I needed to recess these brackets into the top plate of the pony wall, and I whipped up a quick router template for this, and I could just screw the template to the top plate to hold it in place. I routed out the recess with a small flush trim bit installed on my trim router, and I made the cut in 3 passes. I also added some painter's tape to the front of the plywood panel to keep it from chipping out. Once the area was routed, I removed the template and cleaned up any leftover bits of material with a chisel before testing the fit, and thankfully, everything looked good. To install the bracket, I squared it to the wall and then pre-drilled holes using a self-centering drill bit. And the screws provided by iron supports were way too long for my application, so I just used 1¼ pocket screws instead. Once the bracket was mounted, I gave it the old shake test, and it seemed rock solid, plus, as you can see, the bracket ended up perfectly level. That said, after thinking about it, I decided the pocket hole screws maybe weren't the strongest option, and remembered I had some leftover joist hanger screws, which are obviously incredibly beefy. They're structural screws, so I swapped over to those for the rest of the install.
That ain't going anywhere.
I repeated the same process for the other 2 brackets, and once they were installed, I was officially ready for the countertops to go in. So I got these countertops through my local Lowe's, and just for a point of reference, they were about $3,000 installed. So they were certainly not cheap, but I really think the finished countertops look great and should hold up better than most DIY options. That said, if you're looking to DIY your countertops, I did a video on the plywood and laminate countertops I built for the kitchen in our main house, and even with the current price of building materials, you'd come in way under the cost of quartz countertops, and they're also still holding up great 2 years later. Anyway, the first step in having quartz countertops installed is to have a template made, and the templating process was pretty interesting. Since it's extremely difficult to make any adjustments to the quartz on site, these templates need to be pretty darn accurate. And the installer created the template using a combination of corrugated plastic strips and hot glue, and he was able to account for any inconsistencies in the walls or cabinetry by butting the strips tight to those areas. He also added in any necessary overhangs, about 1.5 inches along the front edge of the countertop and 3/4 inch at the ends. Once the template was assembled, the installer reinforced all the connections with staples to make sure everything held together, and then labeled the template with my name and the date. Finally, he could just fold up the templates and zip tie them together to transport them back to the factory. About a month later, the guys came back with the finished countertops to get them installed. And the sink opening was cut to the factory since those edges needed to be polished and rounded since they'd be exposed in the finished installation. The installer cut a few grooves along the underside of the countertop, and this is where the clips, which hold the undermount sink in place, would attach. He also back beveled the edge where the 2 countertop sections meet up, and this just made it easier to get a seamless fit. Once that was done, they could move the first section into the tiny house and get it set in place temporarily. Next, they worked on the other countertop section, and they needed to do a little more work on this piece since they had to cut the opening for the cooktop. And since this cut is hidden by the cooktop, it didn't need to be perfect looking, so they cut these openings on site instead. The installer really took his time laying out this opening, as it'd obviously be a pretty expensive mistake if he cut it in the wrong spot. Once the whole location was laid out, he got to cutting using a combination of a hole saw and cutting wheel, and man was this some dusty work, but it did make for great slow-mo. Eventually the cut was done and the piece popped right out so they could get that section moved into the tiny house. Now, unfortunately, things were extremely tight in the kitchen, as I'd kind of made the mistake of leaving very little wiggle room to try and maximize storage, so it required a little countertop Tetris to get the section in place, and the installer even had to trim back the drywall a bit since the fridge couldn't be moved much to make room for the countertop. They finally got the section set in place, and next they could get the island piece put in place, and the installer measured for the hole for the pop-up outlet in the countertop before they brought the piece in. And once that piece was in, they got to work gluing the 2 sections of countertop together. First, the installer got the sections shimmed so they were perfectly flush, and thankfully, since I installed these countertops using a laser level, they didn't require much shimming. Next, he mixed up this stone countertop adhesive, and the installer tinted the adhesive to match the countertop so the seam would pretty much disappear in the finished installation. Before adding the adhesive, he cleaned the joint with alcohol and then mixed in the hardener with the adhesive before adding it to the joint. After pushing the two sections back together, he cleaned up any excess adhesive and then pulled out one of the cooler tools from this install, this vacuum clamping setup. So these clamps were attached to each side of the joint with vacuum pressure, and then the installer could tighten the clamps to pull the two halves together, closing up the joint in the process. Super cool. The installer continued making minor adjustments from there and removing any excess adhesive until he was satisfied, and then they could get the sink mounted. There were more cool installation tricks here, like setting the sink on a 5-gallon bucket to raise it up so it could be more easily lifted into place. After adding a bead of silicone to the sink flange, the installer got the sink lifted into place, and they were able to hold it in position with the combination of a clamp and a level, which is another great trick.
Pro move right there. I've installed the sink before and I did not do it that way.
Once the sink was positioned where he wanted it, he got the mounting clips installed, and these hold the sink in place permanently, and then he could remove the excess silicone, spraying it down with alcohol first to help keep it from sticking to his fingers. Yet another good pro tip. Finally, he could drill the holes for the faucet and disposal push button, and with that, the main countertops were done. Next, they could get the island wrapped up by first unwrapping it, which is always satisfying. And the only work to do on the island top was to drill the hole for the pop-up outlet, which was pretty simple after laying out the location. Once that was done, the installers caulked where the countertops met up with the cabinets, which both seals the joints to keep water from running between the countertop and the cabinets, but also keeps the countertop in place. And once that was done, the countertops were installed.
Bringing back the Johnny Squat. All right, hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. Obviously getting the countertops in this island installed really made this look a lot more like a finished kitchen. We've only got a couple odds and ends left here in the kitchen and really in the tiny house in general. So probably only 2 to 3 videos left in the series, and then I'm gonna do a big time-lapse video, which I think will be super, super cool, showing the whole process start to finish. So if you guys don't wanna miss that video and the rest of my future videos, go ahead and get subscribed and ring the notification bell. Also, I'll have links to all the tools and materials I use down in the video description below. And last, if you want to support me, I have merch available. I sell plans for a lot of my woodworking projects and the tiny house, and I have Patreon and YouTube memberships set up, so go check those out. All right, thanks for watching, y'all, and until next week, happy building.